So, after years of unconfirmed rumors of its existence, years of silence regarding Elder Scrolls 6, Bethesda, Microsoft, and the studio that actually made this thing, Virtuos, released upon the world the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion Remastered, much to my dismay, raucous fanfare. I have seen everything from people claiming that it puts the entire gaming industry on notice. I have seen people acting like, of course, it's just the best thing since sliced bread, because clearly The Elder Scrolls Oblivion is such a masterclass of an RPG. Unless, you've actually played RPGs other than Oblivion, in which case you know that it's a downright pathetic excuse of an RPG. And I'm going to refrain from going too heavy into specifics here, because this video is about the remaster specifically, but suffice to say, if you want to know more about Oblivion itself, how it was back with its original version, I have a link to my redux of Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion along with Knights of the Nine and Shivering Isles, which should be popping up on your screen right about now, and it will also be in the video description box, so you can check down there and find the link to it there. But very short version is that Oblivion was a crap game back when it came out, and I basically gaslit myself into actually liking it. Because back in the day, when I originally got the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, it was on launch day with the Collector's Edition. I had pre-ordered it because I enjoyed Morrowind so much, and everything I had been seeing in Oblivion up to that point seemed really cool. So on launch day, I was incredibly excited. I know it's impossible to think that I would ever be excited about something, but I was back then. And I had opened up my copy of the game, again, Collector's Edition, so I was checking out all of the extra goodies that were included with it while the game was installing. And then I go and try to play the game, and it doesn't work, because my graphics card did not support Shader Model 2.0. I had a Radeon 9250. Because my only options for upgrading to something that did have Shader Model 2.0, I would have needed to have an AGP slot or a PCI Express slot on my motherboard, and I had neither. I only had PCI. And at the time, even just getting my copy of the game in the first place was basically my big gaming purchase for the entire year. I certainly could not afford to upgrade my computer, so until somebody released a mod that would allow you to play the game with a downgraded shader model, I was stuck with effectively a coaster. Thankfully, somebody did release a mod that allows you to play the game at shader model 1.0 instead of 2.0. Of course, it meant that you were playing the game at lower than the low settings, and it was absolutely hideous and ran like complete garbage. But if there's one thing I've always been, it's incredibly stubborn, so if I picked up a game really wanting to play it, damn it, I was going to get that game working and I was going to play through it. And that's exactly what I did. With the game running at maybe 20 FPS if I was lucky, I played through Oblivion back in the day, and in so doing, effectively forced myself to enjoy it. I went through that much effort to get the damn thing running, I better find something to enjoy about it, right? Well, that illusion got shattered years later when I revisited the game on a computer that could actually run it natively and at a decent frame rate, and found that it's actually a complete pile of crap as far as RPGs go. And frankly, the notion that it's basically a cornerstone RPG for a lot of people who had never played RPGs before Oblivion is frankly just depressing to me at this point. But of course, if you want to know more about Oblivion itself, just as a game overall, check out my review redux of it. It includes the expansions, and it will give you a much more in-depth discussion about what's wrong with Oblivion and why it's frankly a downright crap RPG. And again, links in the description box. I may even throw a pinned comment up having the link to it there. So to go back on topic here in this video, when I found out that Oblivion Remastered was real and that it was made available, I was like, well, crap, I'm pretty much obligated to take a look at it because I am now the Bethesda guy at this point, apparently. So I have to take a look at everything Bethesda ever releases, whether I really want to or not. And I didn't really want to in this case, but you know what, I have Game Pass. I might as well install it and check it out and see if they have actually improved things, and at least be able to tell you whether or not this would be kind of a definitive version to play versus just playing the original game, maybe with mods. And right from the beginning, I already was going, oh, that's not great, because the file size is 120 gigabytes. Now, I know modern gamers who are used to playing the modern Call of Duty games and pretty much anything running on Unreal Engine 5 will think, oh, 120 gigabytes, that's just relatively normal for modern games, and yeah, it is, but that's not a good thing. Modern games just have incredibly bloated file sizes because of uncompressed textures and uncompressed audio files, and as far as I can tell, that's basically what happened here. Obviously, it means that if you try to run this thing on a regular hard drive, the load times are going to be absolutely horrendous, and you are going to have some pretty severe stuttering while it's trying to load stuff in on the fly. So it means that an SSD is absolutely mandatory to try to play this thing, and chances are that if you play modern games at all, you've probably got a very limited amount of space on your SSD, so you're probably going to have to delete something else to fit this game on there. Now, I will be fair in saying that Oblivion is a large game. There is a lot of stuff to mess around with in it. It's just that the quality of that stuff doesn't justify messing around with it. Again, see my review redux of the game for details. But hey, at least you can say Oblivion has a lot of content, whereas most of these other games with absurdly bloated file sizes don't. Now, all of that said, when I actually booted up the game and started messing around with it, right off the bat, I was like, nope, that ain't right. Because the original main menu to Oblivion has a background showing a map of Cyrodiil, more specifically the Imperial City, and it scrolls while the Reign of the Septims track plays. Don't get me wrong, it's a fairly generic main menu, and it's nothing remotely impressive. But then Virtuos had to one-up them on the genericness by making the main menu of Oblivion Remastered just a guy decked out in Legion armor with a silver sword in one hand and a shield in the other, standing in front of a burning alt symbol, which is in front of distant burning castles. I actually scoffed at that because it is exactly the kind of thing I know that very superficial people out there will be like, man, that goes hard, when it's just painfully generic. But then again, Oblivion turned what was supposed to be a really interesting setting of Cyrodiil being a jungle into suddenly it's just generic medieval fantasy Europe. So maybe we can just say Virtuos were tapping into that kind of energy. Anyway, scoffing at the main menu aside, I went into the graphics settings and started messing around with those, and it is pretty fully featured there, so I'll give them credit for that. But I found something that actually kind of blew my mind almost immediately, which is that you don't have to run TAA for this game. Now, for those of you who don't know what TAA is, it is temporal anti-aliasing. It is an anti-aliasing technique that is meant to reduce jagged edges, and to grossly oversimplify this, it does that through a sort of upscaling technique. So it renders something at a lower resolution and scales it up to be a higher resolution, and as a result you end up getting reduced jagged edges. The downside is, it makes the game look incredibly blurry, like you're just smearing petroleum jelly all over the screen no matter what you're doing, and in the worst case scenarios, it makes the image look like it's being dragged or smeared across the screen rather than actually rendered properly, because of the way it's trying to predict the next frames being rendered and just fails to do so ultimately. In short, TAA looks pretty terrible, especially when the game is running at lower frame rates, and unfortunately with a lot of modern games, you either can't turn it off or TAA is the only option for anti-aliasing. Thus, I was pretty pleasantly surprised when I started delving into the graphics options here and found that you don't have to run TAA. In fact, not only can you just run the game at native resolution and not upscale it at all, but you can also run an alternate anti-aliasing technique that doesn't rely on upscaling at all either, namely FXAA. Now, FXAA also looks like crap, but it's not quite as obnoxious as TAA most of the time. There is, however, a problem with this, and that is that Unreal Engine 5 is not designed to run without TAA enabled. You can have other anti-aliasing techniques in it, but it is not designed around them, so you will end up with horrendous visual effects, like the foliage having this horribly pixelated look to it, same thing with hair, for example, and the only way to get it to look like it's kind of supposed to look is to turn on TAA. It makes everything look blurry and awful, but it also means that you don't have this horrible pixelated look that looks just as bad, if not worse. So you're either left running no anti-aliasing at all, or FXAA, in which case you're still going to get that horribly pixelated look and it's just going to look awful. Or you run TAA and you don't have that pixelated look, but everything looks blurry and you get some smearing on the image. There is no winning scenario here, and it's a problem I've run into with every single Unreal Engine 5 game that I've messed with up to this point. The only real exceptions I've run into there are things that were previously on Unreal Engine 4, but at some point got updated to Unreal Engine 5. Ready or Not being a prime example there. It still looks and runs fine, even though it did get updated to Unreal Engine 5, and I think it might have something to do with the way Lumen works, but I'm really not 100% sure there. For those of you who don't know what Lumen is, it's the new lighting technology that was introduced in Unreal Engine 5. It's supposed to be more realistic, gives you ray tracing tech, things like that. But it also means that all the lighting is being rendered in real time rather than being baked into the environments themselves. And given that this kind of pixelated dithering or whatever you want to call it effect appears on shadows as well, that's ultimately why I think it probably has something to do with Lumen. Whatever the actual underlying problem is, it probably will never be fixed. It seems to be a problem specific to Unreal Engine 5, and maybe it will be fixed if Epic releases Unreal Engine 6, but who knows at this point. Frankly, it looks like it's just going to be a problem for years to come because Epic seems completely uninterested in fixing it, and none of the other developers using Unreal Engine 5 seem to know how to fix it either, so who knows? We'll see what happens with that. But anyway, point is that you don't have to run this game with upscaling and TAA enabled, which is nice to see, but clearly the game is designed to run with at the very least TAA enabled. So if you're somebody out there who really hates TAA, then, well, Oblivion Remastered is not the game for you. Anyway, moving on, when I looked at the rest of the graphics settings, everything had defaulted to the Ultra settings, which makes sense given the hardware I'm running. I'm running a Ryzen 9 5900X, 64 gigs of RAM, and an RTX 3080 12GB model. Sure, it's not the latest and greatest hardware, but it's still pretty high-end, and it is complete overkill for 1080p gaming. At least for current generation games, anyway. When the next generation of console hardware rolls around, it'll probably be a bit outdated at that point, but we're still a fair ways off from that, so it is more than sufficient for running pretty much anything I throw at it. And yet, when I booted into Oblivion Remastered and started messing around with it, I was almost immediately reminded of what it was like to play Oblivion back in the day on my Shader Model 1 Radeon 9250. Because to put it very simply, this game runs like shit. When I'm wandering around the open world of Cyrodiil, it is barely scraping by at about 35 to 45 FPS. When I go into buildings, a lot of times it will go up to about 70 to 80 or so, but sometimes it's still incredibly low for no discernible reason. And then when I start going into certain other areas where there are more graphically intense things happening, like more weather effects and such like that, then the frame rate tanks even further. Like going into Kvatch, for example, it was running at about 25 FPS. It was there I decided to do a bit of performance testing and start messing around with the settings because everywhere else it varied wildly, but I could at least stand in one spot in Kvatch and get about 28 FPS on the Ultra settings. And it was there I found that the option to show your VRAM usage doesn't seem to work. So that was pointless to implement if it doesn't seem to work, so I don't know what was going on there. I know that I'm not running out of VRAM or anything, though. I've never actually run out of VRAM at 1080p. So I went ahead and got rid of the VRAM meter since it didn't seem to be doing anything, and I clicked on the auto detect settings, which set everything to the high settings, although interestingly enough, it turned on DLSS when I had it disabled previously. Now, I mentioned this in my rant about Stalker 2 and just modern game performance in general, which I'll go ahead and throw up a link to here as well. But I actually don't run games with DLSS on. DLSS, for those of you who don't know, is an upscaling technique specific to NVIDIA. And I deliberately choose not to run it because I want to know what the game's actual performance is running natively, without any kind of upscaling enabled. Because that will tell me how well the game is actually optimized. If I run it with upscaling, then that's just the developers using upscaling as a crutch to compensate for poor optimization, and what do you know? This game is really poorly optimized. I had to lower the settings down to medium to get something vaguely resembling an acceptable frame rate, and then if I lowered it down to low, then it would stay above 60, but it looked awful. And when I looked at the settings for it, I found that when I set them down to the lowest settings, it put my resolution scaling at 50%. So the game was actually running at 540p, and with the lowest possible settings, and still barely scraping by at about 65 to 70 FPS. And unfortunately, because of YouTube compression, I really don't know how much of what I'm saying is really coming through here, but you've been seeing the gameplay footage throughout this video on the ultra settings up to this point. And the visual quality, while certainly leagues better than the original Oblivion, don't get me wrong, is nowhere near good enough to justify how poorly this game runs. It looks like it could have come out on the previous generation of console hardware, so PS4 and Xbox One. Now, the simple fact of the matter is that this is yet another Unreal Engine 5 game that is horrendously poorly optimized and relies almost exclusively on upscaling techniques to squeeze something vaguely resembling playable performance out of it. You know, generally speaking, remasters are supposed to touch up the visuals, touch up the audio, and, of course, introduce a few quality of life features that may not have necessarily been in the original game, maybe fix some bugs and glitches that were in the original game, and generally provide a more robust, more enjoyable experience right out of the box than the original game. And sure, they have done some of that. But here's the thing. You can install Oblivion on damn near any computer these days and it will run just fine. You might have to limit the frame rate because the physics glitch out if you go past 60 FPS. But other than that, you don't really need to do anything to it to get it running smoothly on any modern PC, or frankly any PC released since about 2010 or so. And while the visuals are dated, the only thing that's really awful looking in them is the character models, which are just hideous. That did get dramatically improved with the Oblivion Remaster, but if the game runs so poorly and looks so bad because of forced upscaling or TAA to get something vaguely resembling a playable frame rate, or having to just crank all of the settings down just to get a vaguely playable frame rate, then improvements in visuals are entirely moot. I would much rather have a smooth playable frame rate than much nicer visuals, and if I want that, then I could just boot up the original Oblivion. In fact, if I wanted to play Oblivion, I would just boot up the original Oblivion anyway, because the changes they made to the remaster that are ostensibly supposed to improve it don't actually improve it. If anything, they actually make it worse. You see, the big changes came in the form of tweaking the combat and tweaking the leveling. Now, leveling was never really the main problem in the original Oblivion. A lot of people cite it as one of the biggest problems, but it was never really the problem in and of itself. It was a weird system, don't get me wrong. You had to rest in order to level up, and that was the only way you would improve your stats, but you could just keep using all of your different weapons and spells and such like that to continually improve your skills regardless. Your level would increase based on the levels you would gain in major skills for your given class, and that did create an imbalance with leveling all of your non-major skills, but that created a leveling system that was awkward, kludgy, and certainly not good, but it wasn't the main problem. The main problem was the level scaling. Everything in the world scaled with your level, so if you continued to level up, enemies would start getting better and better gear, they would be doing more and more damage, they would get higher and higher health pools and damage resistances, and eventually you would hit the point where the only way you could actually do damage to enemies was to have over 100% damage reflection, because they would just have so much health, so much damage resistance, that you could really only get through combat by effectively glitching the game out. Ironically enough, it was better to play through Oblivion without leveling up at all, because you could do that and just play through the entire thing at level 1, and only level up when you got to something that you wanted to complete that was level gated, like some of the Daedric quests, for example. Because to give you an idea how ridiculous this kind of thing was, you would eventually have basic bandits running around decked out in Daedric gear, and Daedric gear is supposed to be ridiculously rare to the point where it's practically legendary. The only thing rarer than Daedric gear in Elder Scrolls games up to Oblivion was unique gear, aka items that there were only one of in the entire game. And yet, with Oblivion's level scaling being the catastrophic dumpster fire that it was, you would end up with all of the bandits just running around fully decked out in Daedric gear by the end of the game. It was utterly insane, and it made higher level play in the game just utterly miserable, so you would want to just play the game at a lower level and just never level up past a certain point. So what did Virtuos do to remedy this problem? Well, They changed the way that leveling up actually works so that now non-major skills factor more into it, and you can actually level up by leveling your non-class skills. And they also tweaked the stat improvements, so you now get virtue points whenever you level up, and you can put those into up to 3 attributes, and just spread those out more or less how you want as the game goes on. And that's actually all they did to the leveling mechanics, period. They didn't address the level scaling problem at all. They just tweaked the way you level up. And what they've done to the leveling system itself barely even constitutes improvement. So instead of focusing on the main problem with the leveling, that being the level scaling, they focused on the slightly kludgy and awkward way you actually level up, and decided to make that very slightly less kludgy and awkward. To give you a comparison to, say, treating an injury here. This is like if somebody got rolled into the ER because they just got their limbs severed, and instead of the ER personnel treating the severed limb, they treated a bee sting on what's left of that person's limb and then called it a day. Funnily enough, we can even extend this lack of logic to the combat tweaks. They did make some tweaks to the combat system. Now, the combat system in the original release of Oblivion was very simplistic, but was still an improvement over Morrowind's constantly missing because of dice rolling mechanic. The way it worked is that if you press the attack button, you'd do a quick basic attack, and if you pressed and held the attack button, then you would charge up a power attack, and you would have different power attacks depending on which direction you were moving while executing the power attack. And as you continued leveling up your weapon skill, you would eventually unlock the advanced versions of those power attacks that would have additional bonus effects. And that would also change the animation that played when you did those power attacks. You also had a single spell slot that you could have something equipped in, and you could use the cast spell button to just quickly cast it, and you had a block button so you could just block incoming attacks. It was simple, it was straightforward, it was admittedly very spammy because you generally would just continually hammer the attack button and just keep doing light attacks until eventually things fell over, and it did ultimately become quite tedious and boring after a while, but it was still an improvement over Morrowind's dice rolling mechanics where you would go up to an enemy and just keep swinging and constantly miss them, even though you're standing right in front of them, you're swinging your weapon directly into them and it doesn't seem to be doing anything. In Oblivion, at least, when you swung and something was within range, you would hit it. Now, Virtuos sought to improve this system by improving the audio-visual feedback during combat, because according to them, the original game didn't have things like sparks when you hit things that aren't fleshy, blood spatters when you hit things that are fleshy, sound effects when you swing your weapons around and clash with enemy weapons, or clash with their shields, or just hit them in general. And so they, of course, implemented all of these things. Which is pretty funny to think about, because all of these things were in fact in the original Oblivion, and that just tells me whoever thought that they weren't didn't actually play the original Oblivion. And it didn't make any real difference at all, so task failed successfully, I suppose. But they did make some changes to the actual combat animations and the way those feel. More specifically, they implemented a combo pause. So now, instead of constantly swinging your weapon at enemies in a very quick manner, you now continue to do the exact same thing. It's just that there's a pause after every third or fourth strike, depending on which weapon you're using. Which, in turn, just makes the combat feel even worse than it already did. Enemies are already damaged sponges to begin with on higher difficulty settings, because all the difficulty settings in Oblivion did was just increase enemy stats, so they just end up being complete damage sponges. They do really obnoxious amounts of damage to you, and it just makes everything much more tedious. It's much better to play this game on the medium or lower difficulty settings, simply because it makes combat less tedious, and the implementation of a combo pause does not improve this, it only makes it even more tedious than it already was. And then on top of all of this, they decided to implement a mechanical change to character creation in general that is just confusing. So, rather than male and female like you had in the original game, they decided to do the typical modern-day thing of body type 1 and body type 2. Body type 1 being feminine and body type 2 being masculine. This presents a slight problem because the original release of Oblivion actually had slight stat differences depending on whether your character was male or female. And that was in addition to the stat differences based on which race your character was. So how do they remedy this? Well, they tried to implement an origin system to where that replaces the stat differences for male and female. So, for example, with Nords, you have Western Nords and Eastern Nords, and depending on which of those you select, it basically just means that you're selecting either male or female stat distribution from the original game. Now, regardless of which of these stat distributions you pick, your character is referred to by the gender of their body type. So if you're body type 1, you're referred to as female, and if you're body type 2, you're referred to as male. And you have no way of changing this. There's no pronoun selector or anything like that. It's just body type 1 and body type 2. Body type 1 again being female and body type 2 being male. So what is the point of implementing the body type 1 and 2 anyway if you're just going to have them be male and female anyway? And look, I try not to talk about politics as much as I can here, but this is one of those things where I have to say something about it because it's just stupid. Every single time I see the body type selector and it just says type 1, type 2, type A, type B, whatever the hell it says, I always roll my eyes because it's almost always completely half-assed. For example, in Elden Ring, body type A and B, you're called male or female depending on which one you select. It may as well just say male or female. Exact same thing happens in Oblivion, because the original Oblivion was just male or female, and they decided to change it in Oblivion Remastered to body type 1 and 2, and change the mechanics so that now it's an origin instead of gender related. Okay, changing the statistical differences from male and female to an origin system, I don't really think anybody has a problem with. What people have a problem with is changing male and female to type 1 and type 2, and not only doing that, but completely half-assing the whole thing so that type 1 is female anyway, and type 2 is male anyway. Elden Ring has the same problem. If you picked body type A or B, the characters would refer to you as male or female depending on which body type you were. You didn't have a pronoun selector or anything like that. It was just, well, this is just a different way of saying male and female. So why bother with it in the first place? Don't bother just changing to body type 1 or 2 or A or B or what the hell ever, just to win a few virtue signaling points with slacktivists and journos who don't even play video games in the first place and just spend all their days whining about every insignificant thing that comes along. If you're gonna go the type A, type B, type 1, type 2, what the hell ever route, then don't half-ass it, fully commit to it. Put in a pronoun selector or a gender selector or what the hell ever in addition to body type. This kind of idiotic half-measure crap where type 1 or 2 or type A or B just end up being synonyms for male and female needs to stop. It's stupid, everybody sees through it, and the only results of it are going to be as follows. First, there's going to be the crowd who never gave a shit about it in the first place and are just going to pick whatever suits them. There's going to be the crowd who are actually annoyed by this, and they're going to be voicing their complaints to you and potentially not even buying your game if they feel annoyed enough. And then there's the crowd you're actually virtue signaling to, the ones where you're like, hey look, we're being more inclusive, and they are a downright minuscule amount of people who were never going to be buying and playing your game in the first place. And in the case of Oblivion, it's especially stupid. The original game had male and female, and absolutely nobody had any problems with that whatsoever. You didn't need to change it for the remaster, and yet you went and did it anyway in such a half-ass pathetic manner that one of the very first and most popular mods for the game was to change it back to male and female. So the mechanical changes they have made to the game don't actually make it any better. If anything, they make it worse. And the visuals are certainly improved, but at the cost of running like complete shit. So what's left? What else does this remaster bring to the table? Well, they added in more voices for the various characters that you'll interact with beyond what was in the original Oblivion, because, in their words, the original Oblivion was limited by the space on the disc, which it was. But weirdly enough, most of the new voices they've added are actually worse than the original games, and the original game's voice acting was not very good. I mean, sure, there are a few decent lines here and there are a few characters that are better than others, but there are a lot of meme-worthy lines in the original Oblivion, and that carried forward into Oblivion Remastered, because why would they get rid of the memeable lines? I mean, that's what people remember from the original game, right? So what they ended up doing was they implemented a lot more voices for side characters that people aren't necessarily going to remember, so things like guards or just people walking around town and things like that. But they also implemented it for some of the shopkeepers. And something was horribly wrong when I walked into Slash and Smash, the weapon shop in the Imperial City, and went to talk to the proprietor only for him to not give the emphasis that is shown in the subtitles.
Slash and Smash, the Big Orc Weapons Shop. Big weapons for big heroes.
Meanwhile, in the original Oblivion, he said,
Slash and Smash, the Big Orc Weapons Shop. Big weapons for big heroes.
Sure, it was a kind of crappy line, but it had emphasis, at least. It had some character to it, whereas the character in Oblivion Remastered sounds like he was voiced by AI. In fact, it feels that way for a fair few of the lines encountered throughout the game. Now, I don't know if they actually did use AI for some of the voices or not, but when the developer is pretty enthusiastic about including all these extra voices in the game and acting like it's some sort of improvement, and yet quite a few of the lines are so monotone they sound like they were created by AI, that is, at absolute best, really unfortunate, and at worst, a really terrible look. Because it absolutely screams lack of care and cheapness. And unfortunately, that is more or less how I can describe Oblivion Remastered as a whole. It's not all bad, don't get me wrong. I mean, the visual improvements are nice to have, I suppose, but unfortunately it falls into the same trap that a lot of Unreal Engine 5 games have over the past several years, where they all just look very similar to one another, and you have these kind of washed out colors, everything just looks really generic, and it all just ends up being really bland and soulless. For all of its many, many faults, the original Oblivion at least had quite a lot of color to it. It was bright and colorful and vibrant, and the same really isn't true of Oblivion Remastered. It just looks like every other Unreal Engine 5 game, just with a fantasy skin applied to it. And all the changes they made outside of the visuals and audio to bring it up to more modern quality standards in that regard, ultimately either didn't make the game better or outright made it worse. I mean, they didn't even do anything like improving the inventory interface so it's easier to navigate. If anything, it's actually clunkier to navigate than the original game's inventory, which is baffling because the inventory in the original Oblivion was not very good. They've made trying to pick up items and either drag them around the environment or simply pick them up and put them into your inventory somehow clunkier than they were in the original game. I mean, in the original game, if you saw an item and you pressed the action button when you were looking at it, you'd just pick it up. And you could press the grab button and hold that down in order to pick it up and move it around as a physics object. Oblivion Remastered, on the other hand, has both of these functions bound to the action key, so when you go to try to pick up an item, it sometimes won't think you're trying to pick up the item and instead are trying to manipulate it as a physics object, so you end up just pressing the button and nothing happens, and so you have to press it a couple of times before it finally picks up the item and puts it in your inventory. Honestly, the only thing I can think of off the top of my head that was a legitimate improvement over the original Oblivion is that you no longer get completely showered in journal entries at the beginning of the game for all of the DLC, because that was something that was really annoying about the original Oblivion, where if you had any of the DLCs, like Frostcrag, Spire, Fighter Stronghold, etc., you would just get inundated with all these journal entries while you were going through the tutorial sequence that would then steer you towards the DLC rather than focusing on the main storyline, and while that wasn't as much of a problem if you had already played through the game, obviously for a new player it was a bit overwhelming at first. Especially considering that the vast majority of that content was just inconsequential side stuff like player housing and such. Meanwhile, the more substantial Shivering Isles expansion was introduced a lot more organically. Meanwhile, in Oblivion Remastered, you don't get inundated with all of these journal entries anymore, but it's still easy to find all of the content if you know where it is, and if you start asking around for rumors, it'll start steering you towards that stuff anyway. So it's definitely an improvement over the way it was integrated into the original Oblivion, but it's still a fairly inconsequential improvement. And with that being the only legitimate, full-on positive I can lay at the feet of the Oblivion Remaster, I'm ultimately just left completely bewildered by the response this thing has gotten. Because when you look at the entire thing as a whole, it's basically just a worse version of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, and the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion was already not a good game. Oh sure, Bethesda fans will endlessly sing its praises and act like it's pretty much the best thing since sliced bread, but when you start delving into it beyond the most superficial of levels, the entire thing completely falls apart, both as just an RPG in general, and especially as an Elder Scrolls game. And this remaster takes what was already a really crappy base, improves visual fidelity and some of the aspects of the audio at the cost of extremely poor performance, to the point where the game is barely even playable, It does absolutely nothing to fix the myriad glitches the game suffers from, many of which cause crashes, and in fact, I've had the game crash on me numerous times. Funnily enough, the original Oblivion is actually more stable than this, which is just baffling to think about. But then again, I guess I shouldn't be surprised considering that this game's engine is some kind of Frankenstein's monster of creation engine, or really more Gamebryo, because back when Oblivion came out, it was still Gamebryo, it wasn't the creation engine. But that old, archaic code running inside of Unreal Engine 5, so it's a wonder the game even works at all. But funnily enough, because they've set it up this way, it's considerably less moddable than the original Oblivion was. That was one of the few saving graces Oblivion had, where the game was highly moddable and had official mod tools. Bethesda and Virtuos are not supporting that for the Oblivion Remaster. They are not supporting mods at all, they're not releasing mod tools for it, and since it's running in Unreal Engine 5, it is considerably less moddable than the original Oblivion, and with a franchise that is well known for being highly moddable, that's a problem. I mean, let's face it, without official mod tools, you are not going to see the likes of Narum at Fate's Edge, which for those of you who are unaware of it, which is probably most of you, is a total conversion mod for Oblivion that basically is an entirely new game built in Oblivion, and the team that made that went on to make Enderall Forgotten Stories for Skyrim. With how locked down Unreal Engine 5 is compared to Creation Engine and Gamebryo, you're simply not going to see that level of mod in the Oblivion Remaster, and frankly, you're probably not going to see very many mods for it at all that are anything other than some simple skins, or maybe some audio replacements, or maybe some UI changes. Things that are much more along the lines of what we would describe as tweaks rather than full-on mods, and I really don't see Oblivion Remastered having any kind of longevity to it as a result. I mean, sure, it'll be a bit of a nostalgia trip for people who do actually like the pile of crap that is Oblivion, but once the rose-tinted glasses effect wears off, you're gonna find that it's simply a worse version of Oblivion that's had the audio touched up a bit and had the visuals improved at the cost of extremely poor performance. And all in all, it's just yet another indicator of how pathetic the state of modern AAA gaming is. Never taking any risks, constantly relying on sequels, remakes, and remasters to bank on people's nostalgia and brand recognition to sell copies of their games, rather than actually making quality games that are worth people's time and money. Nope, it's all about just shoveling out mediocre at best slop for the masses to consume, and clearly it works, because the current peak number of concurrent players for Oblivion Remastered on Steam is over 150,000, and that's without any kind of launch day discounts or anything of that nature. It's $50 US, or whatever your regional equivalent is. I'm sure in most other regions it's much more expensive. All for a worse version of an already crappy game from nearly 20 years ago at this point. And people wonder why there's so much slop that gets released these days, and why AAA gaming continues to get worse and worse with each passing year. Anyway, that's about all I had to say about Oblivion Remastered. I have rambled and ranted about this far more than enough at this point, so if you'll excuse me, I'm going to get back to trying to clear up some of the backlog, because there is, after all, an awful lot in there that I have to catch up on. Thank you all very much for watching. Thanks for bearing with me on this rant, ramble, what have you. And for those of you who've been following the channel plans for the past several weeks, thanks for bearing with me on how long it is taking to get the yearly Q&A done, as well as, of course, catching up on the Sniper Elite review, among many, many other things. I'm still chipping away at the Q&A bit by bit. It's going to take it a while because that's going to be a very long video, and it's going to take quite a bit of editing and compiling time and such like that. But it is, of course, still in the works, as are various other reviews, MTOs, games that infuriate me to no end kind of stuff, etc. So stay tuned for all of that. Thank you all again for watching. If you like the kind of videos I make and you want to help support the channel, please consider contributing on the channel's Patreon. That's the best way to do that. But of course, if you can't afford to do that or you don't want to, that's perfectly fine. I understand. It's just the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.